Welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into Sarah Knight's Get Your Shit Together today, a guide to getting it all together. And we have some great excerpts he sent in. Let's unlock those secrets to a more organized life, shall we?
What I find really intriguing about Knight's approach is how she manages to combine humor with her actual life.
Right.
It's almost as if she's saying, "Hey, it's okay to not be perfect, but let's still aim for better."
It really is refreshing. I mean, who doesn't appreciate a bit of self-deprecating humor when they're trying to figure out how to budget or finally conquer procrastination?
And speaking of relatable, I was really fascinated by how she uses the chipmunks, Alvin, Simon, and Theodore to categorize different levels of organization.
Oh, it's such a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
So Theodore, he kind of represents that feeling of just utter chaos,
Mhm.
struggling with even the simplest tasks. Like, we've all been there, frantically looking for our keys while trying to remember that to-do list that's a mile long. Haven't we all? I think we've all had those Theodore moments.
Mhm.
Then there's Alvin, who's, coasting along, handling the day-to-day, but maybe struggling with those, bigger goals.
Mhm.
It's like treading water, but never quite learning to actually swim.
Exactly. Alvin's comfortable, sure, but not really thriving, is he? And then we have Simon, who, on the surface, has it all figured out, but underneath, he's battling all this pressure. That classic duck on water, calm above, paddling like crazy below the surface.
The perfectionist trap. Knight talks about pushing herself to go to work even when she was sick, which led to, a full-blown panic attack.
Yeah.
A good reminder that trying to maintain that I have it all together facade can really backfire.
Absolutely. Really emphasizes how important it is to know yourself and your limits. Identifying your chipmunk type is that first important step to understanding your organizational strengths and weaknesses. But Knight doesn't just label us, does she? She gives us a roadmap to winning at life, which is about, intentionally directing your energy towards those goals you have.
Hmm. Winning at life sounds a little, well, intense. Are we talking about crushing the competition? Becoming
Yeah.
some sort of productivity robot?
Not at all. It's about aligning what you do with what you really want. Knight emphasizes it's not about perfection. It's about making conscious choices, with your time and energy. It's about those smaller wins that lead to a life that's really fulfilling and has purpose.
So how do we actually, achieve those wins?
She gives us a three-step process: strategize, focus, and commit. So first, strategize, meaning set a very clear goal and break it down into those smaller steps. Then focus, dedicate specific time to tackling each of those steps. And finally, commit, stay on track and resist all those distractions.
So it's about planning and sticking to it.
Mhm.
She mentions an interesting analogy with keys, phone, and wallet. Could you expand on that?
Absolutely. Just as you wouldn't leave the house without those essentials, right? You apply that same diligence to your metaphorical essentials. Those goals, plans, and commitments that are vital to your well-being, the bigger picture. It's simple, but reminds us to prioritize the truly important stuff.
Okay, I like that analogy. Very practical and relatable. Knight herself used this three-step process to make some big changes in her own life, right? Like quitting her corporate job and moving to the Caribbean.
Exactly. Those are specific examples she uses to show how this approach can be used for all sorts of goals, from the everyday stuff to the, seemingly impossible things. It's about taking those big, scary tasks and breaking them down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Speaking of manageable, one of the biggest things I struggle with is that feeling of never having enough time in the day.
Hmm.
How does Knight address this time management dilemma, that we all face?
She takes on the not enough time excuse head on. It's fascinating, really. It's not about magically getting more time. It's about understanding where your time actually goes and making choices about how you spend it.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. But how do we actually figure out where our time goes and feel like entire days just vanish sometimes?
Well, one thing Knight suggests is to really keep track of your time, even those mundane tasks. Like, let's say you think your morning routine is 30 minutes, but it's actually 45. That extra 15 minutes really adds up over time.
Ah, it's like those friends who say, be ready in 15 minutes, but it'll be at least half an hour.
Yeah.
I've definitely been that friend.
Haven't we all? That's why Knight suggests we actually time ourselves doing those everyday things. Helps us understand how long things really take so we can plan accordingly.
Right, so by tracking our time, we gain a better understanding of where those precious hours are actually going. We can identify areas where we might be losing time without even realizing it.
Exactly. And once you have that awareness, then you can start making those choices about how you spend your time.
All right.
You can prioritize the things that match your goals and what you really value.
Now, this next concept is a bit counterintuitive. Knight talks about the power of negative thinking. But won't that just, make us feel worse?
It's not about dwelling on negativity. It's about taking that frustration and using it as fuel for change. Imagine that junked drawer that's just overflowing, that annoyance. It can be the push to finally clean it out.
I get it. It's like that feeling of, I'm so sick of this, I have to do something about it. So it's about using negativity as a motivator for positive action.
That's it. Knight believes focusing on what's not working can sometimes be more effective than, just visualizing what we want. It's about turning that frustration into actual constructive action.
So for instance, instead of just picturing a cleaner house, I should focus on how that clutter stresses me out and use that to motivate me to tidy up.
You got it. It's about using those negative emotions to create positive change. Knight even provides a personal example. She used this to quit her job and move to the Caribbean. Instead of focusing on the dream of the island life, she really zeroed in on the things she hated about her job, using that to fuel that major life change.
That's inspiring. Shows how powerful this can be.
I know.
So far, we've covered understanding our chipmunk type, winning at life by setting goals and sticking to them, tracking our time, and even using the power of negative thinking. What else does Knight have in her organizational toolkit?
She really emphasizes the importance of decluttering our minds before we tackle any, physical clutter. It's about figuring out what really matters and letting go of the rest.
Makes sense. Mental clutter definitely leads to physical clutter, right? It's like when your mind's overloaded with to-dos and worries, you can't focus on anything, let alone cleaning your house.
Right. And Knight argues this mental decluttering is key for any lasting change. It's not just about temporary order, it's about creating space for what's truly important.
Okay, so how do we actually declutter our minds? Do we need to, meditate for hours on end?
Knight's got some really practical tips, especially for managing email, which can be a nightmare. She suggests unsubscribing from those newsletters you never read, using the inbox zero method to clear out your inbox, and writing shorter, more to the point emails.
Those are some good tips. My inbox definitely gets out of control sometimes. It's like a constant stream of distractions and things I feel obligated to respond to.
I know, right? That's why Knight says it's important to have a system for dealing with all those digital demands. It's about taking back control of your time and attention.
Now, this next point really resonated with me. Knight argues that hobbies and creative goals aren't just luxuries, they're actually necessary for, our well-being. This is something I struggle with, feeling guilty for taking time for myself when there's so much else to do.
It's a common misconception that taking care of yourself is selfish. Knight uses this clever metaphor from Homer's Odyssey, Scylla and Charybdis, those scary sea monsters. They represent the challenges of making time for your passions and allowing yourself to do them.
So Scylla is the difficulty of finding the time, and Charybdis is that internal struggle, like feeling unworthy or not allowed to prioritize what brings you joy. It's like constantly battling those monsters just to carve out a little space for yourself.
You got it. Knight argues we need to slay those metaphorical monsters and reclaim our right to pursue those things that bring us joy.
And she walks the walk too, right? Rewarding herself with bubble baths after she finishes less enjoyable tasks.
Precisely. She emphasizes putting those little pleasures into your routine, treating them as rewards for accomplishing those things we have to do but don't necessarily enjoy.
That's great. Finding that balance, right, between responsibility and enjoyment, ensuring we're not neglecting ourselves in the pursuit of productivity.
Absolutely. And Knight even questions the idea that happiness is somehow frivolous. She has this funny story about her parents reacting to her, saying her husband focused on mere happiness his whole life.
Haha. It's like society says we have to prioritize achievement over happiness, as if happiness is this less important goal.
Exactly. Knight challenges that. She argues happiness is a valid goal, something to strive for. It's about recognizing that a life full of joy is a life worth living.
Now, this next part gets a bit personal. Knight talks about her struggles with an eating disorder, which is obviously a very sensitive topic. How does she approach this in the book?
With honesty and humor, as always, she shares her recovery while weaving it into the bigger picture of getting your shit together. She discusses how dangerous perfectionism can be and how it can actually sabotage our efforts to achieve our goals.
That's interesting. How does perfectionism connect to this idea of getting it all together?
Well, Knight, who says she's a recovering perfectionist herself, believes that trying to be absolutely perfect can stop us from finishing things and moving forward. She tells the story about spending way too much time on a baby shower invitation and missing out on other important things.
Oh, I totally relate to that. Getting caught up in the details, wanting everything to be perfect and ending up stressed and overwhelmed.
It happens to the best of us. Knight emphasizes that done is often better than perfect. It's about letting go of that need for flawlessness and aiming for a good enough result that allows you to progress and actually complete things.
So it's like perfectionism is actually a form of procrastination. We're so afraid of messing up that we avoid the task altogether.
Exactly. That's why Knight offers 12 steps for overcoming perfectionism. She stresses the importance of realistic expectations, accepting that things won't be perfect, and getting feedback from others to see our work more objectively.
Those are great tips. We could all use a little less perfectionism, especially these days. So we've covered the dangers of perfectionism. What other mental hurdles does Knight address?
Those usual suspects that hold us back, anxiety, avoidance, and the fear of failure.
Those are big ones. Any suggestions on how to conquer those?
She presents three approaches: ripping off the band aid, the practice test, and understanding the difference between what we anticipate and what actually happens.
Okay, break those down for me one by one. What is this ripping off the Band-Aid all about?
It's about tackling those dreaded tasks head on, recognizing that the anxiety before doing something is often worse than actually doing it, like ripping off a bandage, right? Quick and hopefully relatively painless.
Okay, I can see how that would work. Anticipation can be the worst part. What about the practice test?
That involves mentally rehearsing difficult situations to ease anxiety and build confidence. It's like practicing for a presentation or a job interview. The more you rehearse, the more prepared and comfortable you'll feel when the time comes.
Makes sense. And anticipation versus reality.
It's about realizing that the fear before an event is often much bigger than the event itself. You challenge those catastrophic thoughts and replace them with a more realistic assessment of the situation.
So basically acknowledging that our fears tend to blow things out of proportion. Like that big presentation might not be as scary as we think it is.
Exactly. Our thoughts aren't always accurate reflections of what's going to happen.
Okay, so we've got some tools for anxiety, avoidance, and fear of failure. What's Knight's final piece of advice for, getting our shit together?
She stresses the importance of accountability. She shares a very personal story about telling her mom about her eating disorder, which gave her the support she needed to recover.
That's powerful. Shows how important it is to have people who support and encourage us, especially when things get tough.
Absolutely. And Knight connects this to the idea of who raised you. Getting an outside perspective can be a much needed reality check, helping us see our own choices and behaviors more clearly.
So it's about recognizing that we don't always see things clearly, and getting guidance from others can be super helpful.
You got it. And that accountability can come from different places, friends, family, therapists, even online groups. The key is finding people or groups that offer a safe and non-judgmental space to talk about your struggles and celebrate your successes.
That's a great point. It's about finding those people who cheer us on as we work towards getting our shit together. So we've covered a lot in this deep dive into Sarah Knight's Get Your Shit Together. We've looked at her unique perspective on organization, her practical strategies for dealing with everyday challenges, and her honest approach to personal development.
It has been fascinating. But how about we move on to some specific examples of how Knight applies all this to different parts of life? Finances, relationships, work, you name it. She has a ton of practical advice for navigating the complexities of modern life.
Sounds like we've got more to unpack. We'll dive into those specific examples in part 2 of our deep dive into Get Your Shit Together.
So let's look at how Knight tackles finances, something we all struggle with sometimes. She encourages us to really look at those impulse purchases that can drain our bank accounts and make it hard to reach our financial goals.
Impulse buys. Ugh, those are my downfall, especially those little tempting items near the checkout lines. Any tips on how to resist those?
Well, she uses this analogy of avoiding a murder house to show how eliminating temptation can stop us from spending unnecessarily. So, like if you're prone to impulse buying at the grocery store checkout, try the self-checkout lane or even shop online so you don't even see those displays.
Brilliant. It's like recognizing what triggers you and finding ways to avoid it, out of sight, out of mind. Yeah.
Exactly. She even suggests picturing those tempting items as, say, $25 increments. It forces us to think about the actual cost versus that quick satisfaction of buying it.
I like that. It makes the cost of those impulse buys much more real. So, impulse purchases aside, what about the bigger challenge of actually saving money?
Knight emphasizes that even small amounts, if you save them consistently, can add up to a lot over time. She uses the example of putting aside just $3.57 each day, showing how those small amounts can actually grow into a decent nest egg for retirement or other long-term goals.
Wow, that's a great illustration. Shows you don't need to make huge sacrifices to see results. It's about consistency and discipline, even with small amounts.
Exactly. And she does a good job of explaining those complicated financial concepts like compound interest, making them easy to understand. It's about giving people the tools to take control of their finances no matter their income level.
So it's about changing your mindset from feeling overwhelmed to feeling like you can actually make positive changes, even small ones.
Absolutely. Now let's switch gears and talk about health and wellness. Knight acknowledges that physical activity is important, but she also knows that not everyone loves going to the gym or exercising in traditional ways. She suggests finding activities you genuinely enjoy, emphasizing that movement doesn't have to be a chore.
I love that. So many people are intimidated by exercise, picturing those hardcore workouts. But Knight's approach is more about personalization and finding what you actually like.
Precisely. She talks about incorporating stretching into her own routine to combat stiffness and improve flexibility. It's about finding those small, manageable ways to add movement to your life, even if it's just taking the stairs instead of the elevator or walking during your lunch break.
Great suggestions. It's about finding those little opportunities to move more throughout the day instead of feeling like you need to dedicate hours to intense workouts.
Exactly. And she also talks about keeping a tidy home. She says that doing a quick clean can work in the short term, but it won't last if you haven't dealt with that underlying mental clutter that makes you disorganized in the first place.
So we're back to mental decluttering. It's like cleaning your house without dealing with what's causing the mess. You might get it clean for a bit, but the clutter will return if you don't change your habits.
That's it. It's about addressing the root cause, not just the symptoms.
And she even says it's okay to admit that you just don't care about having a perfectly clean house.
Mm.
That's refreshing. There's so much pressure, especially on women, to have a spotless home. But Knight seems to be saying it's okay to have different priorities.
Definitely. It's about letting go of those societal expectations and focusing on what you value, even if it's different from what's considered normal.
I love that. Defining success on your own terms.
Exactly. Speaking of societal expectations, Knight also discusses the challenges of maintaining good relationships. She acknowledges that it takes effort to nurture friendships and romantic partnerships. She stresses single tasking, especially when spending time with loved ones, as a way to show you care.
That's so important. It's easy to get distracted by our phones or whatever else, even when we're with people we care about. Knight seems to be advocating for a more mindful approach to relationships.
For sure.
Mm.
Putting down the phone, minimizing distractions, and really being present with the people we're with, showing them that we value their company.
So it's about quality over quantity, right? Not just being there physically, but truly being present and engaged when we are.
That's it. And she has advice for those long distance friendships that can fade away without regular contact. She recommends sending postcards or short emails just to stay connected and let people know you're thinking of them.
I love those ideas. It's about making the effort, even when it's not convenient.
Exactly. And she even talks about writing thank you notes, arguing that expressing gratitude is a good way to create positive energy.
I've always admired people who consistently write thank you notes. It's such a thoughtful gesture. But I'll admit, I struggle to find the time or motivation sometimes. Knight's point is that we should prioritize those little acts of kindness that can strengthen our connections.
Absolutely. And she gives some good tips for navigating those difficult relationships that we feel obligated to maintain, even if we don't enjoy them.
Yeah.
She compares it to brushing our teeth or shaving, maybe not fun, but necessary for our well being.
Great analogy. Some relationships aren't always fun and exciting, and sometimes maintaining a basic level of respect is enough.
That's it. It's accepting that some relationships require more effort than others, and that it's okay to set boundaries and prioritize those relationships that bring us joy.
So many people struggle with ending relationships, romantic, platonic, family, you name it. How does Knight approach that?
She believes in being honest and direct, advocating for open communication rather than avoiding the issue. It's about respecting yourself and the other person enough to be truthful about your feelings.
So it's better to have those tough conversations than to let things fester and potentially cause more harm in the long run.
Exactly. She reminds us that it's totally okay to choose to be single, to put our own needs and happiness first, even if society tells us we should be in a relationship.
That's a powerful message. Defining happiness on your own terms, not just following what everyone else says you should do.
Now, let's talk about how Knight's principles apply to work and careers. She offers strategies to improve our work lives, even if we're content with our current jobs.
This is interesting. I think people often think self-help books are for people unhappy in their careers who want a big change. But Knight seems to have advice for everyone, no matter their job situation.
Precisely. She emphasizes the power of delegation. Letting go of some tasks and letting others handle them can free up your time and energy to focus on the more important or enjoyable aspects of your work.
Delegation, something I need to get better at. I often feel like I need to control every little detail, which can lead to burnout.
Yeah.
Knight suggests asking for help and trusting others with certain tasks.
Exactly. It's realizing we don't have to do it all ourselves, and that delegating can actually make you more efficient and productive.
And she's big on taking breaks and actually using your vacation time wisely.
For sure. She cautions against over-preparing for vacation, saying it can negate the benefits of taking time off and make you stressed. It's about letting go of that need for control and actually allowing yourself to relax and recharge.
She even tells a funny story about her own habit of packing and repacking her suitcases multiple times before a trip.
Right. Yep. It's a good example of how we create stress for ourselves by overthinking and over-preparing. She encourages us to relax a bit and be more spontaneous, trusting that things will work out even if they're not planned perfectly.
So it's about finding a balance between planning and flexibility, knowing that sometimes the best experiences are the ones that just happen organically.
Precisely. Now, she also tackles retirement savings. She provides clear explanations of things like compound interest, which can be confusing for many people.
Retirement planning can be overwhelming,
Yes.
especially for those who don't understand financial jargon. What does Knight do to make it easier to grasp?
She uses those simple online calculators to show how even small contributions, if invested regularly, can really grow over time. It's about making those complex financial concepts easier to understand and giving people the confidence to take control of their financial future.
So it's about taking small steps, even if they seem insignificant, and trusting that those efforts will pay off eventually. It's about moving from feeling overwhelmed to feeling empowered to take action.
Exactly. Now, Knight also addresses those deeper mental and emotional challenges that can stop us from getting our shit together. She talks about anxiety and offers practical ways to manage those feelings of worry and stress.
Anxiety is so common these days. I'm curious about her approach. Does she recommend specific coping mechanisms or relaxation techniques?
She talks about having a panic attack herself, which emphasizes how important it is to seek professional help when anxiety becomes a big problem. She also suggests simple but effective coping mechanisms like deep breathing exercises and prioritizing self-care activities like those bubble baths we talked about.
That's encouraging. It reminds us that even someone like Sarah Knight, who seems to have it together, deals with anxiety, and that it's okay to ask for help and use coping mechanisms.
Absolutely. And she also revisits perfectionism, offering 12 sticks to overcome it.
We talked about that earlier regarding work. Does she talk about other areas where perfectionism can be a problem?
She stresses the importance of accepting imperfection in all parts of our lives, setting realistic expectations, and getting feedback from others to have a clearer view of ourselves. It's about realizing that trying to be perfect can actually hold us back from experiencing joy and fulfillment.
So it's about embracing our imperfections, understanding they're part of what makes us unique.
Exactly. She also tackles the tendency to avoid things, especially those tasks or conversations we'd rather put off forever.
So avoidance, that's my thing. I'm the queen of procrastination. What does Knight say about breaking free from that?
Well, she has this funny story about a former coworker whose to-do list was literally all the things she wanted to avoid, showing how that strategy just leads to more stress and problems.
I can relate.
Yeah,
It's like we try to run from our responsibilities, but they always catch up.
that's it. While avoiding things might feel good temporarily, it creates more issues in the long run. Facing those challenges head on, even if it's uncomfortable, is often the best approach.
So those uncomfortable tasks or conversations aren't going to magically disappear. It's better to deal with them even imperfectly than to keep putting them off.
Precisely. And she also talks about the fear of failure. It's natural to feel that, but it shouldn't stop us from taking chances and pursuing what we want.
Fear of failure can be so crippling. It keeps us from trying new things and going after our dreams. Any advice from Nyan overcoming that?
She says to think of failure as a learning experience, recognizing that even the most successful people have had setbacks.
So it's about changing our perspective, seeing failure not as the end, but as a step on the road to success.
Exactly. Failure is part of the process, not the opposite of success. It's about developing resilience and learning to bounce back from those inevitable setbacks.
That's a powerful message. It's about embracing the whole journey, ups and downs included, and not being afraid to fail. Does Knight also talk about self-awareness?
She does. She has this fun exercise inspired by an online survey she did. She asked people to identify things that other people do that make them think, wow, they really don't have their shit together.
Interesting. It's like looking in a mirror, right? Reflecting on our own behaviors that we might not even realize we're doing.
That's it. It's a way to encourage self reflection and make us think about whether we might be guilty of those same behaviors.
So it's about acknowledging that we all have blind spots, areas where we could improve.
Exactly. And she gives examples of those relatable scenarios, like always being late or spending money recklessly. She wants us to think about whether we might be doing those things too.
I love that. It's like those aha moments when you suddenly see a pattern in your own behavior you weren't aware of before.
Precisely. Knight even tells stories about times when she lacked self awareness, showing how important it is to admit our own flaws.
That's really relatable. It's a good reminder that even someone who writes a book about getting your shit together still struggles sometimes. It's about being okay with our imperfections and focusing on progress, not perfection.
Absolutely. Knight ends her book by reminding us that life is inherently messy, even for those who follow all her advice.
That's so true. I often feel like I'm failing if my life isn't perfectly organized. But Knight seems to be saying it's okay to embrace the mess, to accept that things won't always go according to plan.
You got it. She tells a story about facing unexpected problems while writing this very book, emphasizing how important it is to adapt and be resilient.
That's ironic and so relatable. Life loves to throw curveballs, even when we're trying our best to get it together.
It does. She talks about selling her apartment to move to the Caribbean, but then ending up back in the US trying to meet deadlines and finding places to live while finishing the book. She even tells this funny story about staying in a terrible Airbnb with mildew, fruit flies, and a millipede, which made her decide to treat herself to a nice hotel room.
That's both hilarious and reassuring. It shows that even with careful planning, unexpected things happen. It's about adapting, going with the flow, and remembering that setbacks are not failures, they're just part of the journey.
Exactly. Sometimes the best way to deal with a mess is to acknowledge you need a break, prioritize self care, and just accept that things aren't always perfect.
So it's about giving ourselves permission to take a step back, recharge, and regroup, even when we feel like we're behind.
Absolutely. Now, as we move to the final part of our deep dive, let's think about the main takeaways from Knight's book. It's full of practical advice, all delivered with her great sense of humor, honesty, and relatable stories.
It's true. It's a nice reminder that we all have our own shit we're trying to get together.
And even though the journey might be messy and unpredictable, it's all about working towards a more intentional and fulfilling life, one that reflects who we really are. We'll dive into those key takeaways in part 3.
It really is a relief to know that even those who preach organization have those moments where, you know, life throws a wrench in the works and the best solution is pajamas and a plush hotel room.
Right. It's a good reminder that self-care is important. We often think of it as selfish, but taking care of yourself is crucial, especially when life gets tough.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Sarah Knight's Get Your Shit Together, what's the most important thing you want listeners to take away from all of this?
I think it's empowerment. Night gives you the tools to create a life that's in line with what you value, to let go of expectations that don't serve you, and to just embrace the messiness of being human.
It's not about being perfect, is it? It's about making progress, being mindful of our choices, and celebrating those small wins along the way.
Exactly. She focuses on those essential life skills like managing time, finances, relationships, and taking care of our emotional well-being so we can navigate all the complexities of life with more intention and less stress.
And maybe most importantly, she reminds us to give ourselves permission to, as she puts it, pursue mere happiness. Find joy in everyday moments and let go of the things that just don't bring us fulfillment.
Right. She emphasizes that life's a journey, not a destination, and we have the power to make that journey our own. But before we go, let's condense all of Knight's wisdom into 10 key takeaways for our listeners.
Perfect. It's a lot to digest, so having those reminders can be super helpful. What should we start with?
First up, figure out your chipmunk type. Theodore, Alvin, or Simon. It helps you see where you're strong and where you might need a little work when it comes to organization.
Got it. And then we can embrace Knight's idea of winning at life by figuring out what our goals are and using her three-step process. Strategize, focus, and commit to get there.
Don't forget about those little everyday habits like always knowing where your keys, phone, and wallet are. If we apply that same diligence to our goals and plans, we can really improve our overall organization.
Time tracking is crucial too. Understanding how long things really take can make a huge difference in managing our time so we can avoid that last-minute scramble and reduce stress.
And remember the power of negative thinking. Use those feelings of frustration to make positive changes. Sometimes focusing on what's not working can motivate us more effectively than just picturing our ideal outcome.
Mental decluttering is important too, right? Before we tackle any physical clutter, unsubscribe from all those emails you don't read, clear out your inbox regularly, keep messages short, and don't be afraid to hit delete on drafts that aren't serving a purpose.
Absolutely. And make sure you carve out time for hobbies and those things that feed your creativity. They're not just extras, they're essential for our well being. Treat them as rewards for tackling those less enjoyable tasks and allow yourself to simply enjoy life.
Challenge the idea that everything has to be perfect to be successful. Accept imperfection, set realistic goals, and get feedback from others to get a more balanced perspective on your work.
Face your fears. Whether it's anxiety, avoidance, or that fear of failure, remember that the anticipation is often worse than actually doing the thing. Use Knight's techniques, rip off that band-aid, do a practice test, and recognize that the reality is often much less scary than we think it will be.
And find people you can trust to help you stay accountable, whether it's friends, family, a therapist, or an online group. A fresh perspective can offer valuable insights and encouragement.
This is just the start, right? Getting your shit together is an ongoing journey, not a one-time event. It takes effort, celebrating the little wins, and accepting that life will always have its messy moments.
And sometimes the best way to deal with those messy moments is with a comfy pair of PJs and a nice hotel room. Until next time, happy strategizing.